Welcome to my channel. This is Nancy Thompson's Storytelling Corner, where I share folk tales, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of intriguing topics. Thanks for joining me today as we dive into a new story. Today's tale takes us back to the late 17th century, during the colonial era in America. Picture this: along the banks of the Hudson River, in what's now upstate New York, there's a little settlement called Clover Station. The folks there lived by a simple rule: you rely on what nature gives you. If you're up in the mountains, you hunt and gather from the woods. If you're by the water, you fish and trade along the river. Clover Station sat right beside the Hudson, so most of the villagers depended on its clear, flowing waters. Some cast nets for fish, others ferried goods or passengers across the river. It was a hard-working community, and they managed to carve out a decent, prosperous life. In Clover Station, there was a family by the name of Carter. The couple, John and Mary Carter, were well into their 40s when they finally had their one and only son, a precious gift after years of waiting. Seeing how long it took to have a child, Old Man Carter named his boy Jacob, a name meaning rooted or steadfast, hoping he'd grow strong and steady. From the time he could walk, Jacob tagged along with his dad, learning the ropes of river life on the Hudson. After his parents passed away, Jacob lived alone. Now, at 29 years old, he was still a bachelor. All around him, his peers had settled down, married, with kids splashing in the shallows or playing in the muddy banks. But Jacob? He was still on his own. Sure, the Carters weren't exactly rolling in money, but that wasn't the only reason he stayed single. There was something else, something bigger, keeping the village girls at a distance. So, why was Jacob Carter still alone at 29? Was it because he was ugly? Not at all. He was a tall guy, broad-shouldered, with a barrel chest and a sturdy frame that spoke of years working the river. Physically, he was as strong as an ox. Was it his character, then? Some sour disposition that turned people off? Nope. Jacob had a good heart. He was the kind of man who'd drop everything to lend a hand, whether it was fixing a neighbor's leaky roof or hauling firewood for a widow in town. "Hey friend," folks would say, if anyone's in a bind, Jacob's the first one there. So what was the problem? The truth was simple, but strange. Living on the Hudson year-round, Jacob had seen things most folks avoided like the plague. Every now and then, the river would carry down something grim from upstream, bodies, bloated and pale, drifting with the current. Normal people would paddle the other way, whispering prayers or clutching their rosaries to ward off bad luck. But not Jacob. Whenever he spotted a corpse bobbing along, he'd row out, hook it with his oar, and pull it in. If the body had a family claiming it, Jacob wouldn't take a dime for his trouble, just a hearty thank you, and maybe a jug of good cider from their cellar. For the ones nobody wanted, poor souls with no name or kin, he dragged them ashore, dig a shallow grave in the soft earth near the riverbank, and lay them to rest. Over the years, he'd fished out at least 20 of them. Now you'd think this might earn him some respect, a man doing a grim but decent job no one else dared touch. But in Clover Station, it did the opposite. People started looking at him funny. "There's Jacob again, messing with the dead," they'd mutter, crossing themselves as he passed by. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the fact that he was always around death, like it clung to him. No family wanted their daughter hitched to a man who smelled of river mud and mortality. In the end, Jacob had enough. Tired of the whispers and the cold shoulders, he packed up and left the village. Not far from where he'd buried those nameless drifters, there was an old run-down shack by the water. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a sagging roof, but Jacob figured it'd do. He moved in, setting up camp with his little rowboat tied nearby, and settled into a quiet, solitary life. One day, Jacob took his boat out onto the Hudson. The day before, a storm had rolled through, dumping rain that swelled the river high and wild. With the flooding came all sorts of debris, chunks of timber, a busted dresser, even a few pots and pans tumbling in the current. Seeing this, Jacob's heart sank. Looks like trouble upstream, he thought. Some poor folks probably lost everything. The water kept rising, fierce and choppy, tossing his boat around like a leaf in a storm. Soon enough, the hull started taking on water. Jacob cursed under his breath, wrestling the oars to steer toward shore. He was about a mile out when, glancing back, something red caught his eye, a bright splash of color against the muddy brown river. It was drifting fast, crashing through the rapids, and in a blink, it was almost on him. Squinting, Jacob finally made it out. That red thing was a person. Without a second thought, Jacob swung his boat around, digging the oars deep into the churning water. The Hudson was roaring now, a beast of a river, and it felt like it wanted to tear his little rowboat apart. It took every ounce of strength he had, grunting and straining like he was wrestling a bear, to get the boat into the middle of the current. Even though he'd spent his whole life on this river, Jacob had underestimated its fury that day. Just as he steadied the boat, the figure in red swept past him, close enough to touch. Up close, he could see it was a woman, her crimson dress tangled around her like a flag caught in the wind. Quick as lightning, Jacob grabbed the rope he kept for hauling in bodies, a weathered coil he'd used a dozen times before, and flung it toward her. Luck was on his side. The rope landed square across her, hooking her just right. He tied the other end around his waist, braced himself, and rowed hard for shore. Once he hit the muddy bank, Jacob leapt out and hauled the rope hand over hand. Soon, a young woman in that soaked red dress lay sprawled on the ground before him. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers under her nose. A faint breath tickled his skin. She wasn't dead yet. There was still a chance. After some frantic work, pumping her chest and tilting her head to clear the water, she coughed, sputtered, and opened her eyes. Relieved, Jacob hoisted her onto his back and trudged toward his shack. Inside, he stoked the fire and cooked up a pot of cornmeal mush, simple but warm. After she'd eaten a little, her strength started creeping back. Jacob let out a long breath, finally relaxing. But then his hand brushed against something wet and sticky. A sharp, coppery smell hit him, blood. Startled, he looked her over. In the chaos of saving her, he hadn't noticed. Her legs were a mess, coated in dark, clotting blood. Men and women didn't mix like that back then, not without a chaperone or a ring, so Jacob hesitated. But he couldn't just leave her bleeding. Carefully, he grabbed the hem of her dress and tore a small slit, just enough to see. There it was, a gash 2 inches long, deep enough to show bone. Before he could do anything else, she spoke up, voice hoarse but firm, "What are you doing?" Jacob stumbled over his words, flustered. "Ma'am, your leg, it's hurt bad. Look." She propped herself up, wincing but brushing it off. "It's fine. Don't worry about it." He blinked, stunned. Don't worry about it? If that leg didn't get tended to, she'd lose it, or worse. After a beat, he said, "All right, hold on a sec. I'll step out and grab some herbs. Bear with the pain, I'll be quick." With that, he ducked out of the shack. The sun hadn't set yet, and Jacob knew these woods like the back of his hand. It didn't take long to find some yarrow and plantain, old remedies his ma had taught him for cuts and bleeding. He hurried back, arms full of green, but as he neared the shack, a sharp clink rang out, like a bowl shattering on the floor. His pulse quickened. He picked up the pace, sprinting the last few yards. That woman was alone in there, still weak from nearly drowning. He'd been so focused on saving her that he hadn't thought twice about leaving her unattended, manners be damned. Now though, he slowed at the door, cautious. Peering through a crack in the wall, he froze. What he saw nearly scared the soul right out of him. Under the dim flicker of the oil lamp, the woman sat clutching a broken bowl. She was dragging its jagged edge across her wounded leg, over and over. And that leg, it wasn't human anymore. Where skin should have been, there were scales, glinting like a fish's tail. The bowl wasn't sharp, so it took her a while to scrape off a patch of those scales around the cut. Stranger still, she didn't flinch, didn't cry out, like it didn't hurt at all. After a bit, she stopped. From somewhere on her, maybe hidden in her dress, she pulled out a glowing bead, about the size of a quail egg, shimmering with a soft green light. She pressed it to the wound, and in an instant, her leg snapped back to normal, smooth and human again, no scales, no blood. Jacob stood there, cold sweat dripping down his back, hair standing on end. He stumbled backward and sank to the ground, heart pounding like a drum. The woman must have heard him stumble outside, because she suddenly called out, "Who's there?" Her voice cut through the night, sharp and wary. Jacob scrambled to his feet, trying to steady his nerves. "It's me," he said softly, forcing calm into his tone. She paused, then asked, "You're the one who pulled me out, right? Big fella." "Yeah, ma'am," Jacob replied, swallowing hard. "Don't be scared. I just went to grab some herbs. Here, crush these up and put 'em on your wound if you want." He set the bundle of yarrow and plantain by the door, then backed off quick, ducking behind a tree to watch. His mind was spinning. Fish scales, glowing beads. What in God's name had he stumbled into? A minute later, she stepped out of the shack. Under the moonlight, she looked fine. No limp, no sign of that bloody gash. Like nothing had happened. Jacob's stomach churned, but he stayed put, hiding all night with one eye on the shack. By morning, exhaustion hit him hard, and he dozed off in the brush. He woke to voices, her voice. "Hey big guy, you up?" Jacob blinked, groggy, and there she was, grinning down at him like they were old pals. After what he'd seen last night, his gaze darted to her legs. No scales, no cuts, just normal, like any other woman's. Cold sweat prickled his skin again, but she just laughed. "Don't look so spooked. You saved my life. Why would I hurt you? Come on, get up. Ima de breakfast." She turned and headed back inside. Jacob sat there a moment, stomach growling despite himself. She didn't seem evil, odd as hell, sure, but not dangerous. Figuring he'd starve otherwise, he followed her in. Inside, a bowl of steaming cornmeal and a slab of fried fish waited on the table. His belly rumbled loud enough to wake the dead, so he dug in, wolfing it down while she watched with that same easy smile. After that, they fell into a strange sort of rhythm. Jacob didn't pry into her story, and she didn't offer much. Maybe it was what folks call an unspoken deal, live and let live. 5 or 6 days passed like that. Every morning, Jacob took his boat out to fish on the Hudson. The woman stayed back, tidying up the shack, sweeping the dirt floor, patching leaks in the roof. With her around, that rundown heap started feeling almost like a home. One day, Jacob rowed out as usual. The river was calm, mirror smooth, a perfect day for fishing. He'd been at it for years, knew every trick to hook a bass or trout. But that morning, nothing bit. Not a nibble. Frustrated, he started back for shore, muttering about bad luck. He was nearly there when the water turned wild, ripples spreading fast, like something big had spooked the fish. Then, out of nowhere, fish started leaping, big ones, flopping right out of the river. Before he could blink, a half-dozen hefty carp landed smack in his boat, thrashing and silver-scaled. Just as quick, the river went still again. Jacob hooped, grinning ear to ear at the haul. He rowed home fast, hefting the fish over his shoulder, already picturing a good supper. Back at the shack, he called out, "Hey, look what I got. Fresh catch for tonight." But when she saw the fish, her face went white as a sheet. She backed away, hands trembling, refusing to touch them. "What's wrong?" Jacob asked, confused. "They're not good to eat." She edged behind the table, voice shaking. "Get rid of 'em, kill 'em quick. You can't eat those." Jacob frowned. "What, they poisoned or something?" She didn't answer, just kept staring at the fish like they'd bite her. He figured she had her reasons, crazy as they might be, so he shrugged. "All right, no fish tonight. I'll toss 'em." But Jacob didn't kill them. Seemed a waste. Instead, he slipped down to the river and let them go, watching them dart back into the depths. He didn't think much of it, just a kind-hearted whim. Little did he know that one choice nearly cost them both their lives. That night, the Hudson turned restless again. What started as a quiet ripple grew into a churning mess, like the river was boiling mad. Then came the splashing, heavy thumps hitting the shore. Jacob peeked out the shack's window and saw them, 3 big carp, the ones he'd let go, leaping onto the bank. A greenish haze rolled off them, and in a heartbeat, they weren't fish anymore. They twisted and stretched into hulking figures, 3-headed fish monsters, scales glinting under the moon, claws scraping the dirt. They lumbered straight for the shack. Inside, the lamp still burned low. The woman hadn't gone to bed yet. Since she'd moved in, Jacob had taken to sleeping outside under a tarp, giving her the shack. The monsters reached the door, and with a flick of a claw, it creaked open on its own. They barged in, and a piercing scream ripped through the night. Jacob bolted upright, tarp flying off. He'd heard that cry and knew trouble had found them. Grabbing his fishing spear, a sturdy steel fork he used for gigging, and the old rope he kept for hauling bodies, he ran for the shack. Bursting through the door, he caught her voice, trembling, "What do you want from me?" A cold, raspy growl answered, "What do we want? You know damn well. Hand over that bead, or you're not seeing sunrise." Through a gap in the wall, Jacob got a good look. The woman was backed into a corner, shaking like a leaf, while those 3 fish beasts loomed over her. Their heads, 6 bulging eyes apiece, glared down, dripping slime onto the floor. His heart hammered, but he couldn't just stand there. Timing it right, Jacob hurled the spear with his left hand, aiming for the nearest monster's chest. With his right, he swung the rope, looping it around another's neck. The beasts were so focused on her, they didn't see him coming. Too late for them. The spear sank deep into one, and with a gurgling screech, it burst into a cloud of black smoke, collapsing into a puddle of muck. The rope hit its mark too. The second it tightened around the second monster's throat, the cord glowed faintly, like it had caught a spark.
The creature threshed, letting out a stench-like rotting fish as it burned from the inside.
In seconds, it melted into a gooey heap, just like the first. 2 down in a flash. The third one didn't stick around. Spinning on its claws, it bolted out the door and vanished into the dark.
Jakob stotere, panting, staring at the mess.
He hadn't known his gear could do that. That spear and rope, they were just tools he'd used for years to fish out the dead from the Hudson. He'd always figured it was a grim but honest job, giving those lost souls a resting place. Turns out, all that time handling the river's ghosts had worked some kind of magic into them. The danger gone, Jacob turned to the woman. She was still huddled in the corner, wide-eyed and shaking. He looked at her, she looked back. For a long stretch, neither said a word. Finally, he broke the silence. What in the hell was that? She took a shaky breath, then spoke slow and steady. All right, big guy, I'll level with you. I'm not human. From there, she spilled the whole tale, and Jacob finally pieced it together. Turns out, a few miles upstream, there was a deep lake off the Hudson, a place folks called Mirror Hollow. Under its waters lived a clan of beings, older than the colonies themselves, guarding the lake and its secrets. Her father had been their leader, a kind of river king watching over Mirror Hollow. The people there thrived because of it, plenty of fish, clean water, a good life. But 6 months back, a strange wounded fish washed up. Her dad took it in, nursed it back to health. Grateful, the fish offered a gift, a glowing bead, a treasure tied to the lake's power. Trouble was, that fish wasn't what it seemed. It stuck around, got greedy, and soon demanded the bead back, not as a gift, but as leverage to control everything under the water. The woman's father saw through the fish's scheme, but it was too late. The creature cursed him, locking away his power so he couldn't fight back. Before the fish could take over, he slipped the bead to his daughter. Her name was Abigail, she finally said, and told her to run. She escaped the lake, but the fish's goons caught up, slashing her leg as she fled. That's when the Hudson swept her downstream, right into Jacob's path. That big fish didn't quit though. It wanted the bead, Abigail called it the Lake Heart, to rule Mirror Hollow for good. Those 3 monsters were its muscle, sent to scare her into giving it up. Lucky for her, Jacob's river-haunted tools had sent them packing. He rubbed his jaw, still reeling. So if that's the story, that fish ain't gonna stop. What's the plan? Abigail glanced at the spear and rope in his hands, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Didn't expect you to have those. They've got some kind of mojo from all those years pulling souls out of the river. As long as we've got him, that fish won't dare come close. It can't snatch the bead if I'm not alone, and in a couple weeks, once I'm healed up, it won't stand a chance against me. Hearing that, Jacob felt a weight lift. The next day, he went back to fishing like nothing happened. The Hudson was generous. His nets came up heavy with bass and perch. He kept a few for supper and hauled the rest to market in Clover Station. While haggling over a basket of fish, an old man sidled up. "You sellin' those, son?" he asked, voice creaky as a barn door. "Nah, just curious about someone," the man said with a grin. Jacob chuckled. "Well, you're talkin' to the right guy. I know every face from here to the next county. Who you lookin' for?" The old-timer leaned in. "Fella named Jacob Carter. Fisherman, 'bout your age." Jacob squinted at him, gears turning. That was him. "Why you a skin after me?" he said, cautious. The man's face lit up. "Well, I'll be, found you already. Name's Elias Wade. Your ma ever mention a distant cousin from downriver?" "That's me. Guess you'd call me kin." It rang a bell. His ma had talked about an Elias once, years back when she passed. Jacob tipped his hat. "Sorry, cousin, it's been a while." Didn't recognize you. What brings you here? Elias clapped his shoulder. Just passin' through after some business. Figured I'd look in on you. Last time I saw you was at your ma's funeral, little sprout back then. Time flies, huh? The sun was dipping low, so Jacob waved off the market. Come on, Elias, you're stayin' for supper. We'll crack open some cider and catch up. Back at the shack, Abigail was bustling around, straightening up. She froze when she saw Elias, eyes narrowing. Jacob laughed it off. This here's my cousin Elias, long-lost family. He's bunkin' with us tonight. Abigail shot him a quick look, a warning, but said nothing. Supper was tense. Jacob kept an eye on Elias, who claimed he couldn't drink much on account of his health. Something felt off. His hands were too clean, too soft for a working man, and he carried a faint whiff of fish, not river mud. Later, Abigail pulled Jacob aside. You sure he's kin? I don't trust him. He's got a smell, like that big fish. Jakob's gut twisted. That night, he and Abigail stayed awake, spear and rope close. Sure enough, past midnight, Elias slipped out of his room, floating an inch off the floor like a ghost. He glided to their door, peering in. Jacob sprang, looping the rope around his neck, but it didn't glow. Elias laughed, a wet, guttural sound. That old trick? I swapped your rope, boy. You're done. A blast of white smoke poured from his mouth, and Jacob and Abigail hit the dirt, out cold. The big fish, Elias in disguise, lunged for the bead. But a gust of icy wind roared through, clearing the smoke. Jacob came to, blinking at a new figure, a pale white-clad shape with arms stretching like taffy. It grabbed the fish by the throat, and with a gurgle, the monster melted into sludge. The figure vanished in a chilly breeze. Next day, Abigail headed back to Mirror Hollow, promising to return. Jacob wandered to the graveyard where he'd buried those river souls. There he spotted a white dress, same as that ghostly savior's. A cracked tombstone nearby bore a face he'd pulled from the water years ago. A shiver ran through him. Had the dead repaid him? Weeks later, Abigail was back, settled in as his wife. Guess you're stuck with me, she teased. And that's the end of Jacob's tale, folks. Now on to the next one, a story of good and evil, where karma always catches up. The Heart of Mercy starts in western Pennsylvania, with a family named Harper. Alright, folks, welcome back to Nancy Thompson's Storytelling Corner. Our second tale's called The Heart of Mercy, a folk story about good, evil, and the way fate has a habit of balancing the scales. Picture this. Back in the early 1800s, out in western Pennsylvania, there's a little trading town nestled in the rolling hills. This is where the Harper family sets down roots. James Harper was a merchant, a decent man with a knack for business. His wife, Margaret Harper, was the kind of woman everyone loved, gentle, honest, and always ready with a warm smile. The two of them got along like peas in a pod, building a life selling goods, grain, cloth, whatever folks needed. But every family's got its struggles, and the Harpers were no exception. The trouble was kids. Margaret had borne 3 little ones over the years, but none made it past 6 months. Frail as autumn leaves, they'd slip away before they could even crawl. James couldn't stand the thought of their line dying out. A man's got to leave something behind, right? So he took the load off Margaret. No more heavy chores, just rest and care. He'd brew her teas from the apothecary, hoping to strengthen her for one more try. Behind his back, Margaret prayed hard. Lord, she'd whisper, if I've done right by you, bless us with a strong child. Heaven must have heard, because when she hit 30, she delivered a bouncing baby boy, healthy as a horse. Since he was their fourth, James named him Miles Harper, hoping the kid would grow up sturdy and live a long, steady life. Miles didn't disappoint. From the cradle, he was a strapping little guy, big-boned and full of grit. He had a good heart, too, but a stubborn streak a mile wide. James worried that fire might lead him astray, so he sent Miles to the local schoolhouse for a few years, figuring some book learning might tame him. Time flew, and by 16, Miles was a looker, tall, broad, with a grin that could charm the birds from the trees. 2 years back, he'd started working the trade with his dad. Miles had a sharp head on his shoulders, smarter than James in some ways. He'd haggle deals that left the old man scratching his head, sometimes bringing home more coin than James ever did. Folks around town couldn't stop singing his praises. That Harper boy's got a gift, they'd say, tipping their hats. Over in the north end of town, old man Amos Reed ran a little shop peddling cheese and cured meats. He had a daughter, Clara Reed, pretty as a picture, with golden hair and eyes like a spring sky. Suitors lined up from here to Pittsburgh, some just loitering by the shop to steal a glance. Amos was picky, though. He wanted a good match for his girl, and out of all the fellas, he liked Miles Harper best, steady, smart, and from a solid family. The Harpers and Reeds hashed it out and set a wedding date. Everything was falling into place, until fate threw a wrench in the works. Just before the big day, tragedy struck. Amos Reed and James Harper passed away within days of each other, Amos from a bad fever, James from a fall off his wagon. The town mourned, and Miles and Clara's wedding got pushed back 3 years, leaving them both reeling. After his dad's death, Miles stepped up. At 18, he borrowed some cash, bought a mule, and took over the family trade. He started hauling goods farther afield, across county lines, chasing bigger profits. It was tough, lonely work, but it paid off. 2 years later, he built a tidy little nest egg, proving he could hold his own. Not far from the Harper place lived the Wheeler family. Sam Wheeler was a teamster, drove wagons for a living, ever since his wife passed young. He raised his only son, Caleb Wheeler, a year younger than Miles, on his own. That spring, Sam took a bad spill when his wagon flipped into a ditch, busting his leg something fierce. From then on, he hobbled around on crutches, barely scraping by. Desperate, Sam went to Miles. "You've got a good head for trade," he said. "Could you teach Caleb the ropes? Give him a way to eat." Miles didn't hesitate. Sam had been a friend to his pa, and he figured it was the right thing to do. "Sure, Sam," he said. "I'll take him under my wing." From then on, whenever Miles hit the road with his mule, Caleb tagged along, learning the ins and outs of the business. The next fall, Miles and Clara finally tied the knot. The wedding was a sight. Neighbors and friends packed the little clapboard church, spilling out into the yard with well wishes and homemade cider. Clara wasn't just a beauty, she had a heart of gold, soft-spoken, hard-working, and sweet as pie. She looked after Miles, honored Margaret like her own ma, and won over the whole town. Miles hit the jackpot, folks whispered, half jealous, half happy. The year after, Miles loaned Caleb some cash to strike out on his own. "You've earned it," he told him. Sam and Caleb couldn't thank him enough, tears in their eyes, promising to pay it back tenfold. Clara didn't just bring luck to Miles, she brought a golden touch. Ever since she stepped through the door, the Harper trade boomed, bigger hauls, better deals. By the next fall, she gave birth to a chubby baby boy they named Henry Harper, hoping he'd live long and strong. The house rang with laughter, everyone over the moon. Caleb's business picked up too. With Sam's blessing, he married a farmer's daughter from out of town, Ellen Wheeler, a plain but sturdy gal with a quick laugh. The Harpers and Wheelers grew tight as kin, visiting back and forth, sharing meals, looking out for each other. Miles and Caleb were like brothers, always ready to lend a hand or split a load. That autumn, Miles took on a big job, hauling a wagon of medicinal herbs to a druggist in Easton, an old customer about 200 miles east. Clara packed his gear, jerky, a wool blanket, some hardtack, kissing him goodbye with a "be safe, you hear?" Normally, he'd be back in a week, maybe 8 days. But half a month dragged by, and no sign of Miles. Margaret and Clara paced the house, worry gnawing at them. Caleb swung by, like he often did, with a sack of apples for Henry and a carved wooden horse for the little guy to play with. When he heard Miles was still gone, his face fell. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Caleb, it's been 2 weeks. Me and Clara are sick with fear. Can you go look for him?" Caleb nodded, no questions asked. "Aunt Margaret, say no more. I'm on it." He hitched his mule and headed for Easton that same day. In Easton, Caleb tracked down the druggist. "Miles Harper?" "Oh, he left ages ago," the man said, counting coins. Picked up his pay and headed home. That lit a fire under Caleb. He raced back, told the Harpers, then marched straight to the sheriff. A posse scoured the trails, and a few days later, they found Miles's wagon in a ravine halfway between towns. The mule was gone. Digging around, they turned up his wallet, a boot, and some torn clothes, blood-stained and scattered. Folks reckoned it was wolves. Plenty roamed those hills at night, picking off stragglers. "Must have caught him after dark," the sheriff muttered. Word got back to the Harpers, and Margaret and Clara broke down, sobbing till they couldn't breathe. Henry, just 3, toddled around clueless while the family pillar crumbled. Margaret took it hardest. Grief hit her like a freight train, and she fell ill, bedridden and fading. The Wheelers never forgot what the Harpers had done for them. With Miles gone, they stepped up. Caleb took on the heavy lifting, chopping wood, fixing fences, while Ellen pitched in with the housework, cooking stews and mending clothes. A year later, Ellen passed sudden-like, some wasting sickness she'd carried quiet for years. She'd never had kids, and Caleb was left gutted, but he didn't let it stop him. He kept looking after the Harpers, honoring the debt he felt he owed. Caleb was careful though, folks talk, and he didn't want tongues wagging about him and Clara. He never set foot inside her house unless Margaret was around, always keeping things proper. With his help, Margaret pulled through her illness, bit by bit, until she could sit up and sip broth again. One night, Margaret called Clara into her room. "Miles is gone, and it ain't fair," she said, voice soft but firm. "You're still young, Clara. You can't waste away alone." Clara knew what she meant, remarriage, but her heart sank. She'd loved Miles fierce, and the thought of moving on stung like nettles. "I'm not going anywhere, Ma," she said, tears spilling. "I'll stay, tend to you and Henry." Margaret sighed, patting her hand. "You're a good girl, but you've got years ahead. Caleb's a fine man, kept us afloat when we were drowning. He's lonesome too," lost Ellen. "He's hinted to me he'd take care of you if you'd have him. Think on it, Clara. I won't push, but I'd rest easier knowing you're not alone." The next day, Clara rode out to her folks' place. She laid it all out for her ma, who'd never wanted her daughter widowed so young. Margaret had already talked to Sam Wheeler too. His boy couldn't stay a bachelor forever, and Clara was a catch any father'd be proud of. Sam didn't argue, he liked her pluck. With both families nodding yes, it was settled. 2 months later, Caleb and Clara said their vows. Quiet this time, just kin and a preacher in the parlor. A widower and a widow, they made it work. Neighbors tipped their hats, glad to see 2 good souls find some peace. To keep close to Margaret, Caleb moved into the Harper house, calling her Ma now instead of Aunt. It warmed her heart, seeing him step into the family like that. Henry was pushing 5, and Caleb treated him like his own, tossing him in the air, teaching him to whittle. Clara was grateful, though Miles's memory still lingered, a quiet ache she couldn't shake. 2 years on, Clara bore Caleb a daughter. They named her Grace, small but fierce, a Wheeler through and through. Sam, hobbling on his crutches, doted on her like she was gold, grinning wider than he had in years. Margaret's health steadied, and Caleb's trade grew, hauling lumber and pelts now, raking in solid cash. Sam took to limping along with Henry to the market, buying candied apples and tin soldiers, proud as punch of his patchwork clan. Those were happy days, 2 families stitched together, making folks green with envy. Since Miles's accident, Caleb had taken over the herb runs to Easton. The next fall, he hitched up a load, and Clara packed him off with a stern "watch yourself out there." He made it to the druggist fine, collected his pay, and grabbed some trinkets, a ribbon for Grace, a pipe for Sam. Heading back the next day, he hit the mountain stretch late afternoon, 4 or 5 miles of thick woods where Miles had met his end. The old mule pricked its ears and stopped dead. A rustle came from the trees, then a low growl. Wolves, dozens of them, poured out, eyes glinting in the dusk. Wolves weren't rare out there, but broad daylight? That was off. Caleb's blood ran cold. He cracked the whip, urging the mule on, but the pack closed in fast. The wagon couldn't outrun them. As they lunged, snapping at his heels, Caleb muttered, "Reckoning," before their jaws dragged him under. Days later, a trapper found what was left. 1 man, 1 mule, torn to shreds in a gulch. Caleb's head was all that stayed whole, a grim marker of what happened. Word hit home, and the families shattered. Sam took to his bed, old wounds flaring up. Margaret's sickness crept back, worse than before. Clara, heartbroken twice over, gritted her teeth. 2 old folks and 2 kids needed her, and she'd be damned if she let them down. Clara clung on, scraping by with what savings they had. Neighbors pitched in where they could, firewood here, a bushel of corn there, but the weight of 2 dead husbands in 6 years crushed her spirit. Tongues started wagging. Some called her a jinx, a black cloud over any man she loved. Half a year passed. Margaret rallied a bit, Sam improved some, and Clara forced smiles for Henry and Grace. Life limped along. New Year's Eve rolled around, and while other houses glowed with laughter and fiddle tunes, the Harper place felt hollow. Reunion was a word that stung. Margaret, Sam, and Clara plastered on grins for the kids, hiding the ache. As the sun dipped low, hooves clattered outside, slowing to a stop. A knock rattled the door, then a voice boomed, "Ma, I'm home." Margaret froze. Clara's jaw dropped. "That's Miles," she gasped. "My boy's voice." Sam blinked, muttering, "Can't be." Clara bolted up, flinging the door wide. There he stood, Miles Harper, taller and tougher than before, a scruffy beard framing his face, a scar slicing his left cheek. Behind him, a dozen soldiers in blue coats stood sharp, muskets gleaming. Clara and Sam went rigid. Margaret trembled. "Ain't my son's ghost, is it? Come to say goodbye." Miles dropped to his knees, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "Ma, I ain't dead. I'm back, alive." Neighbors, hearing the ruckus, peeked out, jaws dropping at the sight of Miles Harper, risen like Lazarus. Margaret stumbled forward, touching his face to be sure, then pulled him inside. "Sit, son, tell us everything." Over a crackling fire, Miles spilled the tale. 7 years back, on that eastern run, wolves hit him hard in the mountains. He fought, tumbled down a ravine, and blacked out. When he woke, he was in a trapper's cabin, patched up but blank, couldn't recall a thing but his last name. The man who saved him, Jack Brennan, was a hunter with a young wife, Sarah, and a toddler girl. They lived in a speck of a place called Pine Notch, 30 miles off. Jack had found him bloodied, wolves circling, and ran them off with some buddies. They hauled Miles home, nursed him 2 months. He healed, but his past stayed foggy. Jack was set to ask around for his kin when war broke out. Militia recruiters swept through, drafting every able body. Miles got nabbed, tagged as Miles Brennan for the roles, and shipped south to fight in Tennessee. He proved a scrapper, brave, quick, earning stripes fast. After the rebellion fizzled, his unit got sent to guard a fort in Ohio. Jack, now his captain, went home for his family, and that's when Miles's memory clicked. Home, Clara, Henry, all of it. He begged leave, rounded up some men, and rode hard for Pennsylvania. 7 years gone, and here he was, a soldier, not a merchant, back with a tale no one saw coming. The town buzzed, slapping his back, toasting his luck. Miles had his boys unpack smoked venison and bacon from their saddlebags, firing up a feast in the yard. Neighbors dug in, hollering welcome home, like it was the 4th of July. Sam sat quiet, missing Caleb. Clara, who'd lived as Caleb's wife, hung back, guilt gnawing at her. Miles, hearing the whole story from Margaret, took it in stride. War had burned the petty out of him. After the crowd thinned, he raised a tin cup to Sam. "You and Caleb were family when I couldn't be. Thanks for watching over Ma, Clara, Henry. From now on, you're my pa, and Grace is my girl." Sam choked up, downing his drink, touched deep. Miles sent his men to bed down, then sat with Clara. She blushed, head low, thrilled he was alive, ashamed she'd moved on. He took her hand, voice steady. "Clara, what's past is past. After New Year, we're heading to Ohio, big house at the fort, room for all of us. Sam too. We're family, and that's that." She broke, sobbing in his arms, years of hurt pouring out. Miles stared out the window, sighing. Time had flown. Margaret and Sam passed on years later, old age claiming them gentle. Miles rose to a colonel, retired at 70 back home. Henry joined the army. His wife was Jack Brennan's daughter. Grace wed a soldier's son, happy as a clam. Clara gave Miles 2 more boys and a girl, all grown and settled now. Spring came, and Clara fell ill bad. On her deathbed, she pressed him, "Miles, how'd you really fall that day? You never said." He sighed, spilling the truth at last. It wasn't just wolves. Caleb had set him up. Miles gripped Clara's hand, his voice low as the firelight flickered. "You want the whole story? All right, here it is." That day 7 years back, on the road from Easton, it wasn't just bad luck. Caleb Wheeler had turned on him. Truth was, Caleb had been sweet on Clara since they were kids, burned with envy when Miles won her hand. Even after marrying Ellen, he couldn't let it go, nursing a quiet grudge. That trip, They'd crossed paths by chance, Miles coming back from Easton, Caleb hauling goods the other way. They stopped to rest in the mountains, swapping tales over a cold campfire. Miles bragged about Clara, her cooking, her laugh, proud as a peacock. Caleb, meanwhile, was in a slump, his trade souring, his mood darker than a storm cloud. Hearing Miles go on snapped something in him. Jealousy boiled over, and a wicked plan took root. While Miles bent to water his mule, Caleb grabbed a thick branch and swung, cracked him hard across the skull. Miles dropped, blood pooling, out cold. Caleb thought he'd killed him. Kneeling there, he mumbled apologies, spilling his guts, how he'd loved Clara, hated Miles for having her. Miles heard it all through a haze but couldn't move. Caleb, figuring wolves would cover his tracks, dragged him to the ravine and shoved him down. He spooked the mule off, smashed the wagon, and hightailed it to a far-off inn, laying low a few days before slinking home. Back in town, Caleb played the hero, searching for Miles, tending the family, all a damn act. Ellen's heart trouble gave him an out. The doc said she wouldn't last. Caleb slipped her extra laudanum, hurrying her end, dreaming of Clara. When Ellen died, he cozied up to Margaret, dropping hints till she pushed Clara his way. He took Miles's trade, his wife, even fathered Grace, living high on a lie, easing his guilt with good deeds. But fate's a funny thing. Caleb wanted Miles' wolf food, yet Miles survived, rising while Caleb met the jaws he'd meant for his friend. Karma, Miles said, jaw tight. He got what he gave. Clara's eyes widened, horror sinking in. She'd shared a bed with that snake for 6 years. Bile rose at the thought. "Why didn't you tell us when you got back?" she croaked. Miles sighed deep. "He kept you and Ma alive when I couldn't. Henry too. If I'd spilled it, you'd have carried that weight, maybe hated yourself. Grace didn't deserve to know her pa was a rat. We were all happy enough. Why stir the pot?" Clara let out a ragged breath, tears streaking her face, then shut her eyes. By morning, she was gone, grief and sickness claiming her at last. They buried her with a simple marker, her name carved deep. Caleb had schemed and clawed for a prize he couldn't keep, ending in a wolf's belly. Miles, raised kind by James, blessed by his pa's good works, turned disaster into triumph. He dodged death, built a legacy, 3 sons, 2 daughters, all thriving. That's the tale, folks, good and evil, reward and reckoning. The heart of mercy says it plain, guard your soul, harm no one, 'cause what you sow you reap. Miles Harper showed a man can rise above. Caleb Wheeler proved a bad heart digs its own grave. So there you have it, story 2 in the books. If you liked it, drop a note below, hit that subscribe button, and share it around. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time with another yarn to spin.